Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 Democratic states that could be competitive or even flip in the 2022 midterm elections. Now, I'll preface this by saying that these are states that are Democratic on the presidential level. They consistently vote for Democrats by a safe margin. All of these states went for Joe Biden by over 15 points, thereabout. And we're going to be looking at 3 states in the gubernatorial level and 2 on the Senate level that are currently, should be Democratic shoo-ins, but might turn out to be a lot more competitive or sleeper states in which Republicans will actually mount somewhat of a formidable challenge, and Democrats will have to put a significant amount of resources in defending these states. Now, first, before we get into these races, though, we're going to take a look back at the 2021 elections because this is kind of the backdrop of 2022. Early on with the various House races, the Republicans weren't doing as well as they'd like. They were underperforming, particularly in New Mexico's special House election, in which the Democrat overperformed even Joe Biden's performance in the district. But going on to the gubernatorial races, after the failure in the California recall by the Republicans, which kind of really put a damper on their hopes for 2022. Virginia and New Jersey turned out to be a lot better for them than they had thought. Virginia, which was always going to be competitive, a lot of pundits up until late fall said that Terry McAuliffe was going to win this race. He turned out to lose by 2 points to Republican Glenn Youngkin. This, of course, was due to a number of factors. National environment did play a large role, but also the style of campaigns that the candidates ran. Glenn Youngkin ran a masterful campaign in the state that was able to court suburban independents, Republicans, and even some moderate Democrats, galvanizing them around certain issues such as education, COVID, and of course, tax issues and things like that. So he focused really heavy on those issues, and it paid off for him because he ended up winning the race. Now, Biden's approval rating didn't help Terry McAuliffe either. And again, the thing that makes this race so surprising and, such a Republican victory is the fact that Terry McAuliffe was a popular Democratic governor when he left office. He was less popular, I believe, than Northam, but he was still relatively popular. And the year prior, Virginia had voted plus 10 for Joe Biden. Those suburbs snapped back, pretty dramatically in favor of the Republican this time around. The Republicans had an amazing turnout effort. They were able to get out their voters, and they ended up winning this race by around 64,000 votes. Now, the real shock, though, was New Jersey, because not a lot of pundits thought this race was going to come within 3.5 points, as it did. The polls, from the beginning had Phil Murphy up by a significant margin. He was leading by a lot, 20, 28 points, 15 points. It's not really until the fall that Phil Murphy kind of knows he's in trouble. He's only leading by single digits. And Jack Ciattarelli is starting to get 44, 45%. At the end of the day, he outperformed his polls by quite a bit. He ended up with 48% of the vote in the state of New Jersey. And this was a state that Donald Trump was only able to get about 40% of the vote in back in 2020. So it was a significant improvement for the Republicans in the state and really bode well for the 2022 midterms. Now, the first state we're going to take a look at is the state of Oregon. In 2020, the state of Oregon went to Joe Biden by 16.1%. It was, by no means competitive at all. However, Oregon tends to be a bit more competitive on the gubernatorial level. We can go back to 2018, which was a blue wave year, in which incumbent Governor Kate Brown only got a slim majority, 50.1% of the vote, to her Republican challenger's 43.7%. Again, during a year when Democrats were doing exceptionally well around the country. In 2016, the race was just a little bit, was around the same. You had 50.6% for the Democrat, 43.5% for the Republican. 2014 and 2010, very close gubernatorial races with the incumbent Democrat in 2014 only winning by lean margins. So overall, Oregon is a lean blue state on the gubernatorial level. However, I think when you see a race like 2018 in specifically, really all it takes is the right environment and a candidate with the right message to actually eke out a full victory in the state. And 2022 could very well be the year. Again, a lot of polling agencies have this race as only lean Democrat. I think it's going to be very competitive. We hardly have any polling out of the state, so of course we can't really say definitively. But given Oregon's political history and the national environment in 2022, I think this is a state that realistically will be competitive and does have the potential to flip. Now, I don't think a flip is more likely than not, but I do think it is on the table. Moving on east to the state of Illinois. Illinois also tends to have competitive gubernatorial races. If we go back and look at the 2018 election, the blue wave hit Illinois very hard. Incumbent Governor Bruce Rauner was defeated by J.B. Pritzker by over 16 percentage points. This was due to a number of factors. The reason Bruce Rauner did so poorly is he basically, in the eyes of many GOP voters, betrayed the base, particularly on important social issues like guns and abortion. That's why a lot of these southern Illinois counties are basically only light red, because the third party is taking out, in some cases, double digits, 10 or 11% even, of the vote away from Browner. These are votes that obviously would have made the race a lot closer. Bruce Rauner wouldn't have won, but the loss probably would have been a lot less devastating for him if he was able to galvanize the rest of the GOP base. But going back to 2014, 2010, and really throughout the 1990s and 80s, you're going to have all Republican victories. Obviously, with the exception of these 3 election cycles in a row, 2010 was extremely close. Bill Brady was to the right of Bruce Rauner, arguably. He was actually a conservative Republican, and he almost ended up winning the gubernatorial race. He did worse in the suburbs than Rauner did, but he did a lot better in the rural areas, and the turnout factor almost came in for him. He almost ended up winning this race. Bruce Rauner, a far more liberal Republican, ended up winning in 2014 by almost 4 percentage points. So, in off-year elections with the right candidate and the right environment, Republicans tend to perform better than not in Illinois, because the only really safe Democratic area is Cook County. The rest of the state is up for grabs. Obviously, the suburbs now are a lot bluer than they were. If we go to the 2020 election result in Illinois, the suburbs, in some cases, are going by 20 points in DuPage and Lake County. But if you could get the rest of the suburbs to flip in the rural areas dark red, it is possible, with low enough turnout from Cook County, for a Republican to win the state again. Now, I do think a flip in Illinois is very unlikely in 2022. I think J.B. Pritzker will win. However, I do think this state deserves to be on the list, because I do believe that a Republican challenger will probably get the state within single digits, probably, 8 or 9 points perhaps. I think it's not going to be as close as the other states we're going to talk about, but I do think it's going to prompt Democrats to spend a bit more money in the state than they're used to, just because of the national environment going into the midterms. So the next state we're going to take a look at is Connecticut. We talked about Connecticut in a video about a week or so ago, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but Connecticut tends to be fairly competitive in these off-year elections. If we go to take a look back at 2018, for instance, which again was also a blue wave year, the Republican Bob Stefanowski almost defeated Democrat Ned Lamont. He came within 3 points of doing so. We can go back to 2014, 2010. Republicans every single time getting super close. And then, of course, we go back in time. Republicans are winning the governorship of Connecticut fairly consistently. So, it doesn't take a lot. Dan Malloy and Ned Lamont have been the only Democratic governors in Connecticut for literally decades. So it does have a bit of a red streak on the statewide level. Of course, Republicans running in Connecticut for governor tend to be fiscally conservative, socially moderate, or even socially liberal. Bob Stefanowski, with this almost win, despite the blue wave environment, is in a good position. This, I think, realistically could be a Republican flip. Again, none of these are guaranteed, but I do think all of these races will be competitive to some degree. But again, I talked about this state more in another video, but I do think it's going to be relatively competitive come the midterms in the fall. Now we're going to move on to some Senate races. Now these are a bit more interesting because Senate races are a lot more federal. They focus on federal issues and not statewide issues. So these races are a lot less likely to be realistic flips because more voters tend to cross party lines on the gubernatorial level than they do for the Senate. So obviously Washington and Colorado, specifically Washington, very unlikely to actually flip, but could be competitive. We're going to take a look at some of the polling out of the state of Washington for incumbent incumbent Senator Patty Murray, and it's not too good for her. She only is, really, there's only, one poll where she's over 50%, and that's this one, the earliest poll taken back in May. The rest of these polls, she is at 50% or she's hovering around 50%, while it looks like her Republican challenger is gaining momentum. Now, interestingly enough, this is only one poll, but when polled against Patty Murray versus a generic Republican, it is within the margin of error. Now, I don't think this race is going to be a flip, but if we look back at previous Washington Senate races with Patty Murray, excluding 2016, obviously she did very well there, but in 2010, she almost lost her seat to a Republican. Now, this is interesting because Washington hasn't elected a Republican governor since the 1980s, but a lot of these Senate races were arguably closer than some of the governor's races we've seen as of late. So she's had some competitive races, but ultimately 2010 turned out to be her most competitive race since her election back in 1992. And interestingly enough, the polling out of this race actually had the Republican up towards... Oh, sorry, that's not the end. Had the Republican up at the very end. Ultimately, it wasn't enough to unseat Patty Murray. The Democrat had the fundraising advantage. But again, in a state as blue as Washington, a result like this, and again, 2010 was a bad year for the Democrats, but a result like this is very alarming in a state that should otherwise be a lock for the Democratic Party. Now, going into 2022, again, it's still early to tell, and Patty Murray could certainly bounce back from this. But with Republicans having the momentum and Biden's, again, plummeting approval rating, Republicans are more likely to turn out. And I think these likely voter polls are going to show a lot closer of a race than Washington State is used to. And again, Democrats are going to have to spend a lot more money than they would like defending somebody's seat like Patty Murray's when they could be putting it into taking states like Pennsylvania back, Wisconsin, Georgia, holding on to Georgia. So it really does divert precious resources from the Democrats to defend seats that should otherwise be safe. Now, the last state we're going to look at is the state of Colorado. Obviously, out of the 2 Senate seats, this is a lot more likely to flip. We can take a look at the incumbent, Michael Bennet, who back in 2016 was able to win his election by over 5 points. He overperformed Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. Of course, he was also elected during a red wave year in the state of Colorado, 48.1% of the vote to 46.4%. So it was an extremely close race, and pollsters actually thought the Republican Ken Buck was actually going to end up winning this race, as he was leading in the polls up until the election. He was out fundraised by a significant amount, but certainly some of the Libertarian, for instance, and other candidates didn't really help him, although that's probably not the reason he ended up losing. So Bennet does have some electability. He was able to survive a red wave year once. He probably will do it again. I think this race is going to be close. It's interesting because Colorado is a very blue state, presidentially speaking. It's a safe blue state now. Biden won this state by over 13 percentage points. And given the shifts in the suburbs, it really shows you how dramatic this, urge to the left actually was in Colorado. So the polling on this race has Michael Bennet with a considerable lead right now. But, of course, we have some polls, again, early on, but that have a generic Republican beating Michael Bennet. Now, I don't really, buy that. I think when it's all said and done, Michael Bennet is going to hold on to his seat, as he did in 2010. But it does have the potential to be competitive. And, again, with the right Republican, it could flip, but I really think it's highly unlikely. I think Michael Bennet is going to hold on. However, Democrats are probably going to have to spend resources on Colorado to hold on to it. I normally used to have this race as likely. In my latest predictions, I've moved it down to lean. That's where I think it's probably going to end up this time around. So again, these 5 states really shouldn't be as competitive as they are, given how blue they are presidentially speaking, but given the midterm environment, Biden's unapproval, things like that, these races are going to be a lot closer than Democrats would like. So anyway, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel down below so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.